Totally wrong ancient Rome facts. Everyone still believes. You know, it's funny. Ask anyone on the street to name one thing about the Roman Empire, and they'll probably say something about gladiators fighting to the death, or Nero playing the fiddle while Rome burned, or those crazy Romans throwing up in vomitoriums so they could eat more. And here's the thing. Almost all of it is wrong. I mean, completely, totally, hilariously wrong. And yet these ideas stick. They stick because they're dramatic, they're gross, and they make us feel a little bit superior to those decadent ancients. But the reality is far more fascinating. Today we are going to dismantle the greatest hits of Roman mythology. We're talking about the lies, the exaggerations, and the propaganda that somehow made it into our history books. We're going to talk about what the Romans were really like, and trust me, the truth is so much better than the fiction. So forget everything you think you know about ancient Rome. Let's get into it. The gladiator myth. Not always a death sentence. Let's start with the image that defines Rome in the modern mind. The gladiator, the Colosseum, the thumbs down, the roar of the crowd as a defeated fighter gets his throat slit. It's a powerful image. It's also a terrible business model. Every gladiator fight was a fight to the death. You went into the arena and only one of you was walking out alive. Gladiators were a massive investment. Think about it from the perspective of the lanista, the owner of a gladiatorial troupe. You have to buy your fighters or capture them. You have to house them, feed them, and they ate a high-protein diet of barley and beans to build muscle, by the way. You have to pay for the best trainers, the best doctors. A top-tier gladiator was a superstar worth a fortune. Now, are you really going to let that investment get slaughtered in his first fight? Of course not. It's like buying a Ferrari and driving it straight into a wall. Historian Garrett Ryan, in his book, Naked Statues, Fat Gladiators and War Elephants, estimates that gladiators died in only about 1 out of every 5 fights. That's 20%. Most fights were highly skilled, almost choreographed displays of martial prowess. They were refereed. They followed strict rules. They fought with different styles. The Mamido with his big fish-crested helmet, the Retiarius with his net and trident, the Thrax with his curved sword. When a fighter was defeated, he didn't automatically die. He would raise a finger and appeal for mercy. The editor, the guy hosting the games, would then look to the crowd. And contrary to popular belief, the crowd wasn't just screaming for blood all the time. They were fans. They had favorite fighters. They wanted to see them fight again next month. If the fighter had put on a good show, fought with honor and courage, the crowd would wave their handkerchiefs and yell misses. Let him go! The thumbs down gesture we all know from the movies. We're not even sure that's what it meant. Some historians think a thumbs up meant kill him. A drawn sword thrust upwards. A closed fist with a thumb wrapped inside might have meant mercy. It's all very murky. The point is, killing a gladiator was a last resort, not the goal. Dead gladiators didn't make anyone any money. The goal was victory, but more than that, the goal was a good show. A spectacular, skillful, and safe fight that left the crowd wanting more. And it wasn't even just men fighting. We have archaeological and literary evidence of gladiatresses, female gladiators. They were rare, and it was probably seen as a scandalous novelty, but they existed. There are relief carvings from Halicarnassus showing 2 female fighters, Amazon and Achillea, in an intense bout. The inscription says they both fought well and were granted their release. So next time you think of gladiators, don't just think of Russell Crowe. Think of Amazon and Achillea shaking hands after a hard-fought draw. The vomitorium, a very convenient mistake. Okay, this one is my personal favorite because it's so grotesque and so utterly, hilariously wrong. It paints a picture of Romans as these hedonistic pigs gorging themselves on delicacies until they physically can't eat another bite, then rushing off to a special room, the vomitorium, to throw up so they can come back and do it all over again. The vomitorium was a room in a Roman house dedicated to vomiting during feasts. The word vomitorium is real, but it has absolutely nothing to do with puke. Let's go to the source. The word comes from the Latin verb vomere, which does mean to spew forth or to discharge. But think about that for a second. What spews forth? It doesn't have to be stomach contents. A crowd can spew forth from a stadium. And that's exactly what a vomitorium was, an architectural feature. In a massive structure like the Colosseum or the Circus Maximus, you have tens of thousands of people trying to get in and out. How do you manage that flow? You build vomitoria. They are the passageways, the tunnels, the entrances, and exits that sit underneath the seating tiers. When the event ends, the crowd spews forth from these tunnels into the streets. They were a brilliant piece of ancient engineering designed for crowd control. You can actually see them in modern stadiums today. The next time you're at a football game or a concert, and you walk through a tunnel to get to your seat, look up. You might just be walking through a vomitorium. So how did this get so twisted? It probably comes from later satirical writers who took the word literally and applied it to the imagined excesses of the Roman elite. It was a joke that people started to believe, and it stuck because it's such a perfect symbol of decadent Rome. But did Romans ever vomit to eat more? Well, there are a few scattered references to forced vomiting as a medical practice, to settle a stomach or as an extreme cure for indigestion. But as a regular dinner party ritual, there's no evidence for it at all, none. It's a complete fabrication. So let's put this one to bed. The vomitorium is not a barf room. It's a hallway. A very clever, well-designed hallway. The icky white statues. When Rome was a rainbow. When you picture a Roman statue, say a bust of Julius Caesar or a marble god in a museum, what do you see? Pure white marble, right? Perfect, pristine, clean. It feels classical. It feels timeless. Roman and Greek statues were intended to be white marble. They were as colorful as a carnival float. This is one of the biggest misconceptions that archaeologists and art historians have been fighting for decades. The white marble we see in museums is a ghost. It's the faded, bleached-out remains of what was once a riot of color. The Romans painted their statues vividly. They used bright colors, reds, blues, yellows, greens, to depict skin tones, hair, eyes, and clothing. They painted intricate patterns on the edges of togas. They even painted details like eyebrows and eyelashes. This isn't a theory. We have the evidence. When archaeologists find statues, they often find microscopic traces of pigment left in the crevices of the marble. Under ultraviolet light, these traces can sometimes still be seen. And using modern technology, they can create reconstructions that show us what these statues really looked like. And you know what? To our modern eyes, they look a bit gaudy, a bit tacky. They look like carnival figures or something out of a theme park. We've been conditioned to love the clean, white, pure aesthetic of the Renaissance, which was based on a misunderstanding. When Renaissance sculptors like Michelangelo dug up Roman statues, they saw the white marble and thought, this is the ideal, pure form, unadorned. They had no idea they were looking at ancient artifacts that had simply lost their paint over thousands of years. The Roman world was not a world of sterile whiteness. It was a world of color, vibrant, loud, unapologetic color. Temples were painted. Walls were covered in frescoes. Statues were dressed in bright hues. It would have looked more like Las Vegas than like a black and white photograph. So next time you're in a museum, don't see the faded ghost. Imagine the real thing in all its gaudy, colorful glory. Nero the Fiddler, a tale of propaganda. We now come to one of history's greatest villains, Nero. The man is synonymous with cruelty, madness, and artistic vanity. And the story that encapsulates all of that is the Great Fire of Rome in 64 A.D. While Rome burned, the Emperor Nero calmly played the fiddle, watching the destruction with detached amusement. Where do we even start with this? First of all, the fiddle didn't exist. The instrument. The fiddle, or violin, is a medieval instrument. It wasn't invented until around the 10th or 11th century, 1,000 years after Nero. If Nero played anything, it would have been a lyre or a cithara, a stringed instrument common in the Greco-Roman world. So at best he was twanging his lyre. The timeline. According to the most reliable of the later sources, the historian Tacitus, Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. He was at his villa in Antium, about 35 miles away. When he heard the news, he rushed back to the city and organized massive relief efforts. He opened his own palaces to provide shelter for the homeless and arranged for food supplies to be brought in from the surrounding towns to prevent famine. That doesn't sound like a man cackling with glee while his city burns. The politics. So where did this story come from? Politics. Nero was deeply unpopular with the Roman Senate, and the historians who wrote the story of his reign, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, were all writing from the perspective of the senatorial class that hated him. They were writing decades, sometimes over a century, after the fire. They took rumors and turned them into history. The rumor was that Nero had wanted to rebuild Rome in his own image, so he had started the fire himself. Another rumor was that he had mounted a private stage and sung a poem about the fall of Troy, using the fire as his backdrop. These stories were politically motivated propaganda designed to blacken his name, and it worked. The image of Nero the arsonist, Nero the fiddler, has stuck for 2,000 years. The reality is far more complex. He was probably a vain and artistic man, and he certainly used the fire to clear land for his massive golden house complex. But playing a fiddle while Rome burned? That's fiction. A catchy, memorable, and completely wrong fiction. Caesar's last words. A Shakespearean invention. Et tu, Brute? Then fall, Caesar. It is perhaps the most famous death scene in all of theater. Julius Caesar, betrayed by his friend Marcus Junius Brutus, utters those heartbreaking words and succumbs to his 23 stab wounds on the floor of the Roman Senate. Those were Julius Caesar's last words. The real Caesar probably said something else, or nothing at all. First of all, the phrase et tu, Brute is Latin for and you, Brutus. It's a powerful line, but it was invented by William Shakespeare for his 1599 play Julius Caesar. Shakespeare was a playwright, not a historian. He needed a dramatic punchline, and he gave it to Caesar. So what did the real Caesar say? We have two main ancient sources for the assassination. Suetonius, writing about 150 years later, says that Caesar said nothing. According to him, Caesar just groaned at the first knife thrust. But he does add a fascinating detail. Some people reported that as Brutus stepped forward to strike, Caesar said in Greek, Kai su tenan? That means, you too, my child? Or even you, my son? That is a much sadder, more personal, and arguably more powerful line than Shakespeare's. It speaks of a profound personal betrayal. You too, my child? The man he may have treated like a son, the man he had shown mercy to and elevated, was now stabbing him in the back. The other historian, Plutarch, also writing about a century later, says that after being stabbed, Caesar pulled his toga over his head and sank to the ground without a word. He doesn't mention the Greek phrase. So we have two different accounts, but what we don't have is any contemporary record of him speaking Latin. The Et tu, Brute is purely fictional. It's a testament to the power of Shakespeare that his version has overwritten the historical record in the popular imagination. Salting the earth, a very expensive myth. This is a story of total war, the total obliteration of an enemy. After the Third Punic War in 146 BC, the Roman Republic finally destroyed its hated rival Carthage. The story goes that they were so thorough, so brutal, that they sowed the entire city with salt, ensuring that nothing would ever grow there again. The Romans salted the earth of Carthage to make it uninhabitable forever. This is almost certainly a myth, and it's one that doesn't hold up to basic economic logic. Salt was incredibly valuable in the ancient world. It was used to preserve food, and it was sometimes even used as currency. That's where the word salary comes from. To cover the entire territory of a major city like Carthage with enough salt to poison the soil for years would have taken an absolutely astronomical amount of salt. It would have cost a fortune, and for what? A symbolic gesture. Furthermore, none of the contemporary accounts of the destruction of Carthage mention it. The Greek historian Polybius, who was an eyewitness to the fall of the city, describes the destruction in detail but says nothing about salt. The first mention of the salting story comes from sources written hundreds of years after the event. So where did the story come from? It probably comes from a misunderstanding of ancient symbolism. In ancient Near Eastern and biblical traditions, scattering salt on a destroyed city could be a ritual curse, a symbolic act to show that the place was accursed. It wasn't about literally poisoning the soil. It was a magical or religious gesture. It's possible that a Roman general performed some small symbolic ritual involving salt. But over the centuries, that small ritual was blown up into a massive act of agricultural warfare. It's a great story, and it fits our image of Roman ruthlessness. But as a practical reality, it makes no sense. A horse senator. Caligula's sick joke. If Nero is history's villain, Caligula is history's madman. The stories about him are so outlandish, so perverse, that it's hard to believe they are true. And perhaps the most outlandish is the one about his favorite horse. The Emperor Caligula made his beloved horse, Incitatus, a senator or a consul, depending on the version. It's an exaggeration, a massive, politically motivated exaggeration. Let's look at what we know. Caligula did indeed love his horse, Incitatus, and the sources tell us that the horse was incredibly spoiled. He had a stable made of marble, with an ivory manger. He wore a collar of precious stones. He had his own house with furniture and slaves. Caligula would even invite the horse to dinner parties. The story that he made the horse a senator or a consul comes from the historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio, but even they don't present it as a literal fact. They present it as a rumor or as a sick joke Caligula played on the Senate to humiliate them. Modern scholarly interpretation leans heavily towards this being an example of Caligula's twisted sense of humor. He was known for humiliating the senators whom he despised. Threatening to appoint his horse to the highest offices in the land was the ultimate FU to the Roman elite. It was a way of saying, "You are so worthless, so beneath me, that my horse could do your job." There is no evidence that a formal appointment was ever made, or that Incitatus ever showed up to a Senate meeting to debate foreign policy. The story is a symbol of Caligula's madness, not a literal historical event. It was a sick joke that got recorded as fact, and then repeated and embellished for centuries. The fall of Rome. An empire that lived on. Finally, we have to talk about the end. The fall of Rome is one of the defining moments in Western history. The date is seared into our minds, 476 AD. The Roman Empire fell in 476 AD when the last emperor, Romulus Augustus, was deposed. The Roman Empire didn't fall, it just moved house. In 330 AD, the Emperor Constantine founded a new Rome on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. He called it Constantinople. This was a strategic move, placing the capital closer to the wealthy and troubled eastern frontiers of the empire. Over the next century and a half, the empire was administered as two halves: the Western Roman Empire, based in Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople. In 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus in Rome. He didn't declare the end of the empire. He declared himself king of Italy, but he ruled in the name of the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno, who was still sitting in Constantinople. So, from a legal and administrative perspective, the Roman Empire continued to exist. It just no longer had an emperor in Rome. The Eastern Empire, which we modern historians call the Byzantine Empire, though they always called themselves Romania, the land of the Romans, continued for another 1,000 years. They spoke Latin for centuries. They called themselves Romans. They preserved Roman law, Roman literature, and Roman military tactics. They just happened to have their capital on the Bosphorus. When you think about it, the Roman Empire didn't truly fall until 1453, when Constantinople was conquered by the Ottoman Turks. And even then, the legacy of Rome didn't fall. It survived in the Latin language of the Catholic Church, in the legal codes of Europe, in the architecture of our governments, and in the Romance languages we speak: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. Rome is all around us. It never really went away. The silent women, power behind the throne. We tend to think of Roman society as one of absolute patriarchy. Men ruled, women were silent, hidden, and powerless. They were confined to the home, spinning wool and raising children. Roman women were completely confined to the home and had no public role or influence. While they couldn't vote or hold political office, Roman women were far from powerless. They were active, visible, and influential members of society. First, let's talk about property. Unlike women in ancient Athens, who were essentially perpetual wards of their male relatives, Roman women could own, inherit, and dispose of property. By the late Republic, a new form of marriage became popular that left a woman under the legal authority of her father's family, not her husband's. This meant that she remained in control of her own dowry and any inheritance. We have fantastic evidence for this. Take the case of a woman named Julia Felix in Pompeii. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, she owned an entire city block. She owned a massive complex of buildings that included shops, baths, and luxury apartments. She didn't just own them, she managed them. An inscription was found advertising her property for rent. She was a real estate magnate. And then there's political influence. Women couldn't be senators, but they could be the mothers, wives, and daughters of senators. And they used that proximity to wield enormous power. Livia, the wife of Augustus, was a key political advisor to her husband for decades. Agrippina, the younger, the mother of Nero, practically engineered her son's rise to the throne. In 195 BC, Roman women even took to the streets to protest. They were angry about the Lex Oppia, a law passed during the Punic Wars that limited their display of jewelry and fine clothing. They blockaded the streets, cornered politicians, and demanded the law be repealed. And they won. Roman women were not in the shadows. They were in the forum, in the marketplace, and in the corridors of power, subtly but effectively shaping the world around them. The monochrome empire, a world of diversity. Our final myth is about the face of the empire itself. When we picture a Roman, we tend to picture someone with a face like a statue, white, European, probably Italian. Everyone in the Roman Empire looked and spoke the same. It was a homogeneous society of Latin-speaking Italians. The Roman Empire was one of the most diverse and multicultural states in the ancient world. At its peak in the 2nd century AD, the empire stretched from northern Britain to the Sahara Desert, and from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq. It encompassed hundreds of different peoples, cultures, and languages. In the east, Greek was the dominant language. In Syria, they spoke Aramaic, the language of Jesus. In North Africa, they spoke Punic and Berber dialects. In Britain, the common folk still spoke Celtic languages. And people moved. The empire was a highway system. Soldiers from the deserts of Syria were stationed on Hadrian's Wall. Merchants from Gaul set up shop in Alexandria. In 1901, archaeologists in York, England, discovered the remains of a high-status Roman woman. In the 21st century, scientists analyzed her bones and discovered that she was likely of North African descent. She was a wealthy, well-respected woman from modern-day Tunisia or Libya, living her life in the north of England. Even the emperors themselves weren't all Italian. Trajan and Hadrian, two of the so-called five good emperors, were from families that had settled in Spain. Septimius Severus, who ruled at the turn of the 3rd century, was from Leptis Magna in modern-day Libya. He was a North African who spoke Latin with a Punic accent. The Roman Empire was not a nation-state. It was a giant, multi-ethnic, multilingual federation held together by Roman law, the Roman military, and the promise of Roman citizenship. It was a melting pot, not a monolith. So there you have it. We've taken a wrecking ball to some of the most enduring myths about ancient Rome. We've learned that gladiators were more like athletes than death row inmates, that vomitoria are just hallways, and that the Roman Empire was a colorful, diverse, and surprisingly modern place. Why do these myths matter? Because they distort our understanding of history. They turn complex societies into caricatures. They make us think we're smarter than the people who came before us, when in reality, we're just falling for the same old propaganda and tall tales. The real story of Rome is far more interesting. It's a story of innovation, of cultural fusion, of political genius, and catastrophic failure. It's a story about people who were a lot like us, trying to figure out how to run a city, an empire, a life. And that's a story worth getting right. Thanks for listening. And the next time someone tells you about Nero's fiddle, you know what to say. Welcome back. If you thought was eye-opening, buckle up, because we've only scratched the surface of the Roman rabbit hole. The myths about Rome aren't just a handful of funny stories. They're a whole alternate universe that people treat as fact. And here's what's really fascinating. The deeper you dig, the more you realize that most of what we know about Rome comes from three sources: Hollywood movies, Renaissance painters who had no idea what they were doing, and Roman historians who were basically writing political hit pieces disguised as history. So today, we're going even deeper. We're talking about Christian lions, Roman roads, those weird penis necklaces everyone thinks were just for laughs, and the biggest lie of all, that Rome was a civilization of cold, emotionless logic. The Christian lion, buff it. Persecution, exaggerated. Close your eyes. Picture a Roman arena. The crowd is screaming. The emperor is lounging in his box. Down below, a group of frightened Christians huddle together, singing hymns as a massive lion stalks toward them. It's the ultimate image of Roman cruelty versus Christian faith. The Romans constantly fed Christians to lions in the Colosseum. It was a daily occurrence, a favorite pastime, and thousands upon thousands of martyrs died this way. Christian martyrdom in the arena happened. It was brutal, but it was nowhere near as common as popular culture suggests. Let's start with the numbers. The Colosseum was used for about 400 years. In that entire time, the best estimates from historians suggest that only a few hundred Christians were executed there. That's not thousands. That's not tens of thousands. That's maybe one or two a year on average. Why? Because the Romans didn't really care about Christians. Not at first. For most of the early empire, Christianity was seen as just another weird Eastern cult. The Romans had dozens of them. The average Roman on the street probably couldn't tell you the difference between a Christian and a Jew or a follower of the Egyptian goddess Isis. The big persecutions were sporadic and localized. Nero did blame Christians for the fire of 64 AD, and yes, some were killed in horrific ways. But that was a one-off scapegoating event, not imperial policy. There were other outbreaks under emperors like Decius and Diocletian in the 3rd century. But these were usually short-lived and focused on making Christians sacrifice to the traditional gods, not on hunting them down for sport. The truth is, the Romans had much bigger problems. They had wars to fight, rebellions to crush, grain supplies to manage. They didn't have time to constantly round up Christians for lion food. And lions? Lions were expensive. They were exotic imports from North Africa. Using them as a one-time execution device was a waste of a valuable asset. If you had a lion, you wanted it to fight multiple times, to become a star attraction, not to eat a single meal and then sit around digesting for a week. So where did the myth come from? The early Christian writers. When Christianity became the official religion of the empire in the 4th century, the stories of martyrs were amplified. They were used as propaganda to show the triumph of faith over pagan cruelty. The more martyrs you had, the more heroic your history looked. So the numbers got inflated, and the stories got more dramatic, and the image of the Colosseum as a Christian slaughterhouse was born. Don't get me wrong, the Christians who died were real, and their deaths were terrible. But the idea that the Colosseum was constantly running a Christians versus Lions special is pure Hollywood. The perfectly straight roads. Myth of engineering perfection. Everyone knows this one. The Romans built roads, and not just any roads. Perfectly straight roads. Roads that cut through mountains, across valleys in dead straight lines for hundreds of miles. It's the ultimate symbol of Roman efficiency and engineering genius. Roman roads were perfectly straight, no matter what terrain they crossed. Roman roads were incredibly well built, but they weren't stupid. They went around things. Let's look at the most famous of them all, the Appian Way, the Regina Viarum, the Queen of Roads. It runs from Rome to the southeastern port of Brundisium. If you look at a map, you'll see it's impressively straight for long stretches. But it's not a laser line. It curves, it bends, it makes adjustments. Why? Because the Romans understood topography. They knew that going straight up a mountain was suicide, so they'd route the road along a gentler slope, or follow a ridge line, or take a path through the hills. They also had to navigate around private property, sacred groves, and existing settlements. The straight road myth comes from the Romans' own propaganda. They wanted people to think their roads were miraculous. They wanted to project an image of total control over the landscape. And to be fair, they were incredible engineers. They drained swamps, built bridges, and cut through small hills when it made sense. But they weren't idiots. They didn't build roads that would kill your oxen and break your wagon wheels just to prove a point about geometry. The real genius of Roman roads wasn't their straightness, it was their durability. They were built in layers. First, a foundation of large stones, then a layer of gravel or sand, then a layer of smaller stones mixed with lime mortar, and finally, the surface, large interlocking stone slabs that were cut to fit perfectly. This construction is why some Roman roads are still there 2,000 years later, still being used. So next time you hear someone say, all roads lead to Rome, remember, they took the scenic route when they had to. The phallus, not just a dirty joke. This one might make you uncomfortable. But stick with me, because it's one of the most misunderstood aspects of Roman daily life. If you've ever been to a museum with Roman artifacts, you've probably seen them. Little bronze penises with wings, big stone penises carved into walls, penises on wind chimes, penises on jewelry. And you probably laughed and thought, wow, the Romans were perverts. Roman penis imagery was just dirty humor or pornography. The phallus was one of the most important and powerful symbols in the Roman world. It was basically a good luck charm, an all-purpose protective amulet. The Romans called it the fascinum, from which we get the word fascinate. It was believed to ward off evil. Specifically, it warded off the evil eye, the jealous glare that could bring bad luck, sickness, or death. If someone was envious of your success, they might give you the evil eye without even meaning to. You needed protection. And what provided that protection? The phallus. Why? Scholars aren't entirely sure, but it probably comes from the idea of generative power, life force, the ability to create. That power was seen as a counter to the destructive power of envy. You would find fascini everywhere. Babies wore them around their necks to protect them from harm. Yes, Roman babies had penis necklaces. Soldiers wore them into battle. They were carved into the walls of houses, especially near doorways and windows, where evil might try to enter. They were placed in ovens to protect the bread from burning. They were hung from chariots to protect the rider. The most famous example is the tintinnabulum, a wind chime, usually made of bronze, featuring a large phallus with wings, often combined with other apotropaic, evil-averting symbols. You'd hang one in your doorway. The wind would make it move and jingle, and the movement and sound would scare away evil spirits. It's not porn. It's a security system. So when you see a Roman penis, don't giggle. Recognize it for what it is, a serious attempt by an ancient people to protect themselves and their families from the unseen dangers of a hostile world. The toga. Everyone wore one all the time. When you picture a Roman, what are they wearing? A white sheet with a purple border, draped elegantly over one shoulder. The toga. It's the national garment. Everyone must have worn one. The toga was the standard everyday clothing for all Roman citizens. The toga was a formal garment. It was heavy, hot, awkward, and most people hated wearing it. It was the Roman equivalent of a tuxedo. Let's describe the toga. It was a huge semicircle of wool, typically white, about 12 to 20 feet long. To put it on, you needed help. You had to drape it, fold it, arrange it just right. Once it was on, you could barely move. One arm was essentially pinned to your side. It was hot in summer and offered no real protection from cold or rain. And it was expensive to clean. So who wore it and when? Roman citizens were required to wear it on formal occasions. If you were going to the forum for important business, to a court case, to a religious ceremony, or to the games, you put on your toga. It was a mark of Roman identity. The poet Virgil called his people the masters of the world, the race that wears the toga. But for everyday life? No way. For working, shopping, hanging out at the tavern, visiting friends, Romans wore the tunica. Simple tunic, basically a long shirt, usually made of linen or wool. It was comfortable, practical, and easy to move in. Women wore a similar garment called a stola, often with a palla, a shawl over it. Even the emperors hated togas. Augustus, the first emperor, had a law requiring citizens to wear togas in the forum because he thought it promoted Roman dignity, but he himself was known to relax in simple tunics at home. Later emperors basically gave up. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, the toga was almost entirely replaced by more practical garments, surviving only as a ceremonial costume for senators and officials. The toga was the Roman suit and tie. You wore it when you had to. The rest of the time, you dressed like a normal human being. The 12 tables and legal perfection. We're told that Roman law was perfect, that they invented justice, that their legal system was so logical, so fair, that it became the foundation of all Western law. And at the heart of it all were the 12 tables, the first written law code of Rome, inscribed on bronze and displayed in the Forum for all to see. The 12 tables were a model of enlightened, rational law that treated everyone equally. The 12 tables were brutal, weird, and deeply classist. They're fascinating, but not for the reasons you think. Let's look at some of the actual laws from the 12 tables, which date to around 450 BC. First, the classism. The very first table deals with court proceedings, and it makes a clear distinction between rich and poor. If a rich man is called to court and doesn't show up, there are penalties. But if a poor man doesn't show up, he can be taken by force. There's also a law about debt. If a debtor can't pay, he can be sold into slavery or even cut into pieces. And the law explicitly says it doesn't matter if you cut him into more or fewer pieces than you owe, there's no penalty. That's not enlightened. That's terrifying. Then there's the weird stuff. One law forbids mourning women from scratching their cheeks or screaming too loudly at funerals. They thought it was unseemly. Another law says you can't bury or burn a dead person within the city walls. And that one actually makes sense for sanitation. Another says that if a tree hangs over your property and damages it, you can sue the owner. And then there's the famous law about patria potestas, the father's power. A Roman father had absolute power over his family. He could sell his children into slavery. He could kill them. The 12 tables explicitly say that a severely deformed child must be put to death. So why do we romanticize Roman law? Because later Roman jurists, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, developed incredible legal concepts, innocent until proven guilty, the right to face your accuser, the idea that law should be based on reason and equity. These ideas were revolutionary. They influenced everything that came after. But the 12 tables, they were a start. They were important because they were written down, which meant patricians couldn't just make up the law to suit themselves. But they were not fair. They were not equal. They were a product of their brutal, hierarchical time. The Hippocaust. Central heating was everywhere. Here's one that sounds plausible. The Romans were great engineers. They built aqueducts, roads, concrete buildings. Of course, they had central heating. The Hippocaust system is famous. Raised floors, hollow walls, hot air circulating from a furnace. Every Roman villa must have been toasty warm. Every wealthy Roman home had central heating. Hypocausts were incredibly expensive to build and run. They were mostly found in public baths, a few luxury villas, and maybe 1 or 2 rooms in a very rich person's house. Let's understand the hypocaust. It worked like this. You built the floor on top of stacks of small brick pillars pilae. Then you covered the pillars with large tiles, then a layer of concrete, then the final floor. In the walls, you left gaps or used special box tiles tubally to let the hot air rise. Outside, you had a furnace prefurnium where slaves constantly fed wood to keep the fire going. This was not cheap. The construction cost was enormous. The fuel cost was enormous. Wood was a valuable resource. And you needed slaves to tend the fire 24 hours a day in cold weather. Only the wealthiest of the wealthy could afford this for more than one room. Most Romans kept warm the old-fashioned way. They wore more clothes. They used portable braziers, metal pans filled with charcoal that you lit and brought into the room. These were dangerous. They could cause fires or kill you with carbon monoxide poisoning if you weren't careful. But they were affordable. They also used small portable ovens for cooking that would also warm the room slightly. They insulated their houses as best they could with thick walls and small windows. They huddled together. They went to bed early. The Hippocaust was a marvel. It was the peak of Roman luxury, but it was not standard. Most Romans spent their winters shivering just like everyone else in the pre-modern world. The baths. Not a dating service. Speaking of baths, let's clear something up. Roman baths are famous. Huge complexes with hot rooms, cold rooms, exercise yards, libraries, shops. People spent all day there. It must have been incredibly debauched, right? A place for orgies and hookups. Roman baths were primarily places for sex and debauchery. Roman baths were family-friendly community centers. Sex did happen, but it was generally frowned upon, and there were strict rules of conduct. First, let's establish what the baths were really like. You'd go in, pay a small fee, and undress in the apoditerium changing room. Then you'd probably do some exercise in the palestra courtyard, wrestling, throwing a ball, running. Then you'd move through the rooms, the tepidarium warm room to acclimate, then the caldarium hot room to sweat and soak, then maybe a quick dip in the frigidarium, cold pool to close your pores. You'd get scraped down with a strigil, a curved metal tool to remove oil and dirt. Then you'd relax, chat with friends, read a book, maybe get a snack. Women had their own baths or their own hours. In many bath complexes, women used the facility in the morning and men in the afternoon. In smaller towns, there might be separate but smaller facilities for women. Mixed bathing happened at certain times and places, but it was often looked down upon by moralists. The idea that the baths were orgies comes from two sources. First, early Christian writers who wanted to paint pagan Romans as depraved. Second, a few scandalous poets who wrote about the beautiful people they saw at the baths. But these were exceptions, not the rule. Archaeology supports this. In the changing rooms of some baths, you see frescoes of naked figures. But these are usually mythological or decorative. In Pompeii, you can still see the strict rules painted on the walls of some baths. No sex, no gambling, no noisy behavior. These were public spaces. They were for hygiene, exercise, and socializing, not for hookups. Yes, prostitutes probably worked the baths sometimes. Yes, people met and flirted. But to call the baths a den of debauchery is like calling a modern YMCA a den of debauchery, because sometimes people meet there and have sex later. It misses the point entirely. The Roman knows. A question of identity. This is a subtle one, but it's everywhere. When we picture a Roman, we picture a specific face. Strong jaw, short curly hair, and most importantly, a big hooked nose. The Roman nose is a thing. It's a physical type. Ancient Romans had a distinct, recognizable physical appearance, including the famous Roman nose. The Roman Empire was so diverse that there was no single Roman look. The hooked nose on statues is an artistic convention, not a portrait of reality. Let's go back to the statues. When you look at a bust of a Roman patrician from the Republic, you see a guy with a big nose, a strong jaw, and deep wrinkles. This is called veristic portraiture, from the Latin veris, meaning truth. The idea was to show age, experience, wisdom. These men wanted to look like serious, no-nonsense elders of the state. The big nose was part of that serious look. But was it an accurate depiction? Probably not. It was a style. It was a message. I am a serious Roman. I have worked hard for the Republic. I deserve your respect. It's like the serious poses in old photographs from the 19th century. Everyone looked stern and uncomfortable. Not because they were unhappy, but because that's how you posed for a photo back then. When you look at portraits from other parts of the empire, you see completely different faces. In Egypt, Roman officials are depicted in a fusion of Roman and Egyptian styles. In Syria, they have Syrian features. In Britain, they look like Britons who adopted Roman dress. The empire was a mixing bowl. Even within Italy, people moved constantly. Slaves came from all over: Gaul, Germany, Africa, Greece, Asia Minor. Freedmen and their children became Roman citizens. The genetic makeup of the city of Rome was incredibly diverse by the 1st century AD. There was no pure Roman stock. So when you picture a Roman, picture what? A man from Spain? A woman from North Africa? A child of Greek and Gallic parents? A Syrian merchant? A British farmer? They were all Romans. They all looked different. The hooked nose was just a fashion statement in marble. The Roman military, not just discipline. We revere the Roman army, the most efficient fighting force in history. Total discipline, total obedience. Men who would stand in formation and die rather than break ranks. Machines, not men. The Roman legionary was an unthinking robot, crushed of all individuality, who existed only to follow orders. Roman soldiers were individuals with personalities, beliefs, and a rich cultural life. The army was a community, not just a machine. Let's look at the evidence. Archaeologists have found thousands of writing tablets from Roman military forts, especially from Vindolanda in northern Britain, near Hadrian's Wall. These are personal letters, official reports, shopping lists, party invitations. One famous tablet is a birthday party invitation from one soldier's wife to another. Claudia Severa sends greetings to her Lepidina. I invite you most warmly to my birthday party on the 3rd day before the Ides of September. I shall expect you. Give my greetings to your Carialis. Farewell, sister, my dearest soul. This is not a robot. This is a woman inviting her friend to a party with all the warmth and affection you'd find in a modern letter. Another tablet is a soldier complaining that he hasn't received enough beer. Another is a request for more socks and underpants because it's cold in Britain. These are human beings dealing with human concerns. We also find evidence of religion. Soldiers worshiped the official gods of Rome, but they also worshiped their own local gods and gods from their homelands. They built shrines. They left offerings. They had personal beliefs. They also had families. Despite the official ban on soldiers marrying while in service, which was often ignored or circumvented, archaeological evidence shows that women and children lived in the Vichy, the civilian settlements that grew up outside every fort. The soldiers weren't isolated monks. They were husbands, fathers, and neighbors. Yes, they were disciplined. Yes, they could stand and die in formation. But they were also people. The Roman army was a society in miniature, with all the complexity, joy, and sorrow that entails. The Romans invented everything. This is the big one, the metamyth. The idea that the Romans invented everything. Concrete, Romans, roads, Romans, aqueducts, Romans, calendars, Romans, modern civilization. Thank the Romans. The Romans invented most of the technology and institutions of the ancient world. The Romans were brilliant adapters and improvers, not inventors. Their genius was in taking ideas from other cultures and making them bigger, better, and more practical. Let's go through the list. Concrete? The Romans perfected it, yes. They developed a specific formula using volcanic ash pozzolana that made their concrete incredibly durable. Some structures are still standing. But the basic idea of using a cement-like material goes back much further, to the Greeks, Egyptians, and even earlier civilizations in the Near East. Roads? The Persians had an excellent road system centuries before Rome was a major power. The royal road of the Achaemenid Empire stretched over 1,600 miles. The Romans just built more of them and built them better. Aqueducts? The Assyrians and Greeks built aqueducts and water channels long before Rome. The Romans again took the idea and ran with it, building massive structures that still inspire awe. The arch? Definitely not Roman. The arch was used in Mesopotamia and Egypt thousands of years earlier. The Romans just used it everywhere, and they mastered the true arch and the vault. The calendar? The Roman calendar was based on the Egyptian solar calendar, which was based on even older observations. Julius Caesar just reformed it. Law? As we discussed, Roman law was heavily influenced by Greek legal thought and by the legal traditions of the many peoples they conquered. What the Romans were was exceptional implementers. They saw something that worked, a weapon, a building technique, a farming tool, and they asked, how can we make this better? How can we mass produce it? How can we standardize it across an empire? That was their genius. They were like the great companies of the modern world. They didn't invent the smartphone, the internet, or the car. But they took existing technologies and turned them into something that could change the world. The decadent emperors. All of them were mad. We love the stories of the bad emperors. Tiberius with his depraved orgies on Capri. Caligula making his horse a consul. Nero fiddling while Rome burned. Commodus fighting as a gladiator. Elagabalus with his religious fanaticism and sexual fluidity. The list goes on. We think of the Roman Empire as a roller coaster of madmen and perverts. Most Roman emperors were depraved, insane, or both. The bad emperors are the exceptions, and their stories are massively exaggerated by hostile historians. Most emperors were boring bureaucrats who just tried to keep the empire running. Let's do a quick count. From Augustus in 27 BC to the fall of the West in 476 AD, there were about 70 to 80 emperors recognized in some way. How many are truly infamous? Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, who gets a bad rap but was actually pretty competent, Nero, Domitian, Commodus, Caracalla, Elagabalus. That's maybe 10. The rest are names you've never heard of because they were boring. Take Antoninus Pius. He ruled for 23 years, from 138 to 161 AD. He never left Italy. He just administered. He built temples, supported the arts, kept the peace, and died in his bed. He's considered one of the 5 good emperors. But you've never seen a movie about Antoninus Pius because there's nothing to film. Or take Septimius Severus. He was a tough military man from Africa who ruled for 18 years. He died of illness while on campaign in Britain. His last words to his sons were reportedly, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men." Not exactly thrilling drama. The mad emperors are memorable because they're exceptional, and their stories are told by senators who hated them. The Roman senatorial class wrote the history books, and they had every reason to make their enemies look like monsters. Tiberius, according to them, ran away to Capri to indulge in unspeakable orgies. But a more balanced view suggests he was just a deeply private, possibly depressed man who wanted to get away from the toxic politics of Rome. So next time someone tells you the emperors were all crazy, remind them of the decades of peace and boring competence under men like Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. The empire lasted 1,000 years in the West. It didn't do that on a diet of madness alone. The wealth. Everyone was rich. We look at the ruins of Rome, the palaces, the forums, the baths, the aqueducts, and we assume everyone lived like that. The Romans must have been incredibly wealthy. All that marble, all that gold. Most people in the Roman Empire lived comfortable, prosperous lives. The Roman Empire was a pre-industrial society. The vast majority of people were poor. They lived hand to mouth, worked incredibly hard, and died young. Let's talk numbers. Historians estimate that about 80 to 90% of the population of the Roman Empire lived in the countryside, working as farmers. These were not gentlemen farmers. They were peasants. They rented small plots from wealthy landowners or worked on large estates called latifundia. They grew wheat, barley, olives, grapes. They raised a few animals. They paid most of their crop as rent or taxes. They lived in simple huts or small stone cottages with dirt floors. They owned almost nothing. In the cities, things were a bit different, but not much better. Rome itself had about 1 million people at its peak. The rich lived in beautiful domos, single-family homes with courtyards and gardens. Everyone else lived in insulae, apartment blocks that could be 6 or 7 stories high. These were cramped, dark, dangerous, and prone to collapse or fire. You had 1 or 2 small rooms, no running water upstairs. You carried it from a public fountain. No toilet. You used a public latrine or a chamber pot. No kitchen. You bought food from street vendors or cooked on a small brazier. Unemployment was high in Rome. The city was full of poor people who had flocked there for the grain dole, free or subsidized wheat distributed by the state. These people survived, but they didn't thrive. They lived in constant fear of sickness, fire, and crime. And sickness was everywhere. Life expectancy at birth was around 25 to 30 years. If you made it to childhood, you might live to 40 or 50, but disease was constant. Malaria, dysentery, tuberculosis, infections from minor injuries. Childbirth killed countless women. Infant mortality was horrific. Perhaps 30% of babies died before their first birthday. The Rome we romanticize, the marble city of toga-clad senators, was a tiny sliver on top of a vast, struggling, impoverished mass of humanity. The ruins are the houses of the 1%. The other 99% have vanished without a trace. The end. Quick and dramatic. We think of the fall of Rome as a single event, a moment. The barbarians burst through the gates and it was over. The lights went out. The Dark Ages began. The Roman Empire fell suddenly, in a dramatic collapse. The Western Roman Empire unraveled over centuries. It was a slow, messy, complicated process. And most people probably didn't even realize it was happening. The fall of Rome in 476 AD is a convenient date. But let's look at what actually happened that year. Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain, deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and said basically, we don't need a Western emperor anymore. The Eastern Emperor Zeno shrugged and said, fine, you're my representative in Italy. That's it. No massive battle, no sack of the city, just a political rearrangement. The Senate in Rome continued to meet. The Roman elite continued to live in their villas. The laws continued to be enforced, now under Odoacer's name. The average farmer in Gaul or Spain or Britain probably had no idea anything had changed. The Roman Empire, in their minds, was still there. It was just different. The process of transformation had been going on for centuries. Germanic tribes had been settling inside the empire for generations as foederati, allies who provided military service in exchange for land. They had adopted Roman culture, Roman dress, Roman language. The army had been full of Germanic soldiers for centuries. The distinction between Roman and barbarian was increasingly blurry. In Gaul, a Roman aristocrat named Sidonius Apollinaris wrote letters in the 470s complaining about the Germanic Burgundians who now lived nearby. He found them loud and smelly and uncouth. But he also acknowledged that they were in charge and he had to get along with them. His world hadn't ended. It had just changed. The real collapse was economic and demographic. Trade networks broke down. Cities shrank. Population declined. The tax base evaporated. The centralized state could no longer pay for the army or the bureaucracy. Power devolved to local strongmen, bishops, landlords, local military commanders. This happened slowly over decades and centuries. In Britain, Roman rule ended around 410 AD, when the emperor told the cities to look to their own defense. But Roman-style life continued for generations. Villas were still occupied, Latin was still spoken, Christianity was still practiced. It was a gradual fade-out, not a switch flipped to off. The fall of Rome is a useful concept. It gives us a neat endpoint. But history is not neat. It's messy, continuous, and always in transition. The Romans and the Greeks. One big confusion. This one drives historians crazy. In popular culture, Greece and Rome are often mashed together into one big ancient civilization. Greek philosophy, Roman politics, Greek art, Roman engineering, it's all just the ancients. The Romans and Greeks were basically the same culture. The Romans conquered Greece, but they had a deeply ambivalent relationship with Greek culture. They admired it, copied it, and were also suspicious of it. They were not the same. Let's start with the conquest. Rome defeated the Greek kingdom of Macedon in the 2nd century BC and gradually absorbed the Greek city-states into its empire. But culturally, the conquest went the other way. The Roman poet Horace put it best. Captured Greece, took captive its savage conqueror, and brought the arts to rustic Latium. The Romans were in awe of Greek achievements. Greek art, Greek literature, Greek philosophy, Greek rhetoric. All of it was seen as superior. Wealthy Romans sent their sons to be educated in Athens. They filled their villas with Greek statues or Roman copies of Greek originals. They spoke Greek as a mark of sophistication. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote his Meditations in Greek. But at the same time, there was a strong current of Roman suspicion toward Greek culture. The Romans saw themselves as rugged, practical, moral. They saw Greeks as clever, but also slippery, decadent, and untrustworthy. The elder Cato, a famous conservative, warned his son to stay away from Greek doctors because they would kill Romans for money. He thought the Greek culture would soften and corrupt Roman values. The reality was a synthesis. The Romans took Greek philosophy and adapted it. Stoicism, which originated in Greece, became the unofficial philosophy of the Roman elite. They took Greek art and made it their own. Roman portraiture is more realistic and individualistic than Greek idealization. They took Greek gods and renamed them. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, Ares became Mars. But they also kept their own distinct Roman gods and traditions. The Romans were not Greeks. They were a distinct people with their own language, their own history, their own values. They just happened to be the world's greatest borrowers and adapters. The weather. Italy was always sunny. This is a small one, but it shapes our whole image of Rome. We think of Italy as warm and sunny, Tuscany in summer, olive groves and cypress trees, blue skies. The Romans must have lived in a perpetual Mediterranean paradise. Ancient Rome had a warm, pleasant climate, just like modern Italy. The Roman climate was different. It went through phases, including colder and wetter periods, and Rome itself could be freezing in winter. The period of Roman expansion and the early empire coincided with what climate scientists call the Roman Warm Period. From about 200 BC to 150 AD, the Mediterranean was indeed warmer and more stable than in previous centuries. This helped agriculture, supported population growth, and made empire building easier. But it wasn't all sunshine. Winters in Rome could be cold and damp. The Tiber River sometimes froze. Snowfall, while not common, did happen. The Roman elite who could afford it fled to the coast in summer to escape the heat and malaria. They had winter villas and summer villas. In Britain and Germany, the climate was even harsher. Roman soldiers stationed at Hadrian's Wall complained constantly about the cold, the damp, and the lack of wine. They wrote home asking for warm socks and underpants. The Vindolanda tablets prove this. They built heated rooms in their forts. They imported Mediterranean goods to remind them of home. The Roman Empire stretched from the Scottish border to the Sahara. Its climate was as diverse as its people. To imagine Romans always lounging in sunny gardens is to ignore the reality of a soldier freezing his toes off in northern Britain, or a merchant shivering in a Gaulish winter. The gladiator myth returns. The emperor in the arena. We have to come back to gladiators one more time, because there's a specific myth about the Emperor Commodus that everyone thinks is true. You've seen the movie Gladiator. You know the scene. The emperor comes down to the arena and fights as a gladiator, slaughtering terrified opponents. Commodus actually fought as a gladiator in the Colosseum, in real combat to the death. Commodus did fight in the arena, but it was a carefully staged farce, not a real fight. He was never in any danger. Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, was obsessed with gladiators. He trained as one. He loved the attention. He wanted to be a superstar. So he arranged for appearances in the arena, but these were not real fights. He would fight against opponents who were armed with wooden swords, while he had a real sword and full armor. Or he would fight against animals, but the animals were tethered or placed in nets, so he couldn't miss. He would defeat them easily while the crowd applauded. The ancient historian Herodian described it this way. He would kill some of the wild animals and shoot arrows at others. He would also fight as a secutor and would kill all his opponents in the gladiatorial combats. Or rather, they would voluntarily allow themselves to be killed. The senators were forced to watch and to chant, "You are Lord, and you are first, and you are the most fortunate of men." It was humiliating theater, not sport. Commodus was not a brave fighter risking his life. He was a bully with a god complex, playing games with loaded dice. He did die by violence eventually, strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, sent by conspirators. Pod had enough of his madness. But he never died in the arena. That's Hollywood. The aqueducts. Water everywhere. Everyone knows about Roman aqueducts. Massive stone structures marching across the landscape, bringing fresh water to the cities. The Romans must have had incredible water pressure. Fountains everywhere, constant fresh water. Roman aqueducts brought running water to every home in the city. Aqueducts brought water to public fountains, baths, and a few wealthy homes. Most people still carried their water from the public supply. Let's look at Rome itself. At its peak, the city had about 1,000 public fountains and 100 public baths, all supplied by the 11 aqueducts. This was an incredible achievement. The average Roman probably had better access to clean water than the average Londoner in 1800. But that doesn't mean every apartment had a tap. Water was delivered first to the Castellum Aquae, a distribution tank at the city's highest point. From there, it flowed through lead pipes, controversial even then. Some Romans knew lead was dangerous to public fountains, baths, and a few private users who had purchased the right to a connection. These private connections were expensive and required a special permit from the emperor or the Senate. Only the very richest Romans had running water in their homes. Everyone else, the vast majority, went to the public fountain with a bucket or a jar. They stood in line, filled their container, and carried it home, possibly up several flights of stairs in their insula apartment. This was daily labor. It was part of life. The aqueducts made it possible, but they didn't make it effortless. And there's another myth about aqueducts, that they used massive pressure to push water uphill. They didn't. Roman engineers understood gravity. They built their aqueducts with a very slight, consistent downward slope, about 1 in 200 on average. The water just flowed downhill. When they encountered a valley, they either built a bridge, the famous arcades, to carry it across, or they used an inverted siphon, a pipe that went down and up the other side, using the pressure of the water in the pipe to push it up the other side. This was advanced engineering, but it wasn't magic. The sewers. The Cloaca Maxima. Speaking of water and waste, let's talk about the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer. It's famous, one of the world's first sewer systems. Surely it meant Rome was clean and hygienic. The Cloaca Maxima was a comprehensive sewage system that kept Rome clean and disease-free. The Cloaca Maxima was primarily a drainage system for marshes and floodwater. It only served public areas, not private homes, and Rome was still a filthy, disease-ridden place. The Cloaca Maxima was originally built in the 6th century BC during the time of the kings to drain the swampy valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, the future site of the Roman Forum. It was a massive engineering project, a covered drain that channeled water into the Tiber River. Over time, it was extended and connected to public latrines and bathhouses. Waste from these public facilities did flow into it, but private homes? Most didn't connect. As we just discussed, most people lived in apartments without running water. They used chamber pots and dumped the contents into a cesspit, or, more likely, just threw it out the window into the street. There were laws against this, but laws are hard to enforce. The streets of Rome were filthy. Human waste, animal waste, garbage, food scraps, it all accumulated. Rain helped wash some of it into the drains, but rain wasn't constant. The city stank. Flies were everywhere. Disease was rampant. The public latrines themselves were interesting places. Rows of seats over a running channel of water. You sat next to your neighbor and chatted while you did your business. You cleaned yourself with a tessorium, a sponge on a stick, shared by everyone, rinsed in a bucket of vinegar or salt water between uses. Not exactly hygienic by modern standards. The Cloaca Maxima was a marvel. Parts of it are still in use today, but it didn't make Rome clean. It just made it slightly less of a swamp. The Roman family, cold and distant. We have this image of the Roman family, the stern paterfamilias with absolute power, the silent, subservient wife, the children who were seen and not heard, raised by slaves, emotionally distant from their parents, cold, formal, unloving. Roman families were unemotional, hierarchical institutions focused only on duty and lineage. The Romans loved their families. They grieved for their children. They wrote tender letters to their wives. They were human. Let's go back to the evidence. The Vindolanda tablets again. A soldier named Lucius writes to his mother, "I have sent you pairs of socks from Satua, 2 pairs of sandals, and 2 pairs of underpants." It's a practical letter, but it shows a son thinking of his mother, sending her gifts. Another letter from a man named Claudius Terentianus to his father. "I ask you, Father, to send me by the first available person. A sickle, a mattock, an axe, and a pruning knife." He's asking for tools, but the tone is respectful and familiar. This is a son writing to his dad. Funerary inscriptions are perhaps the most powerful evidence. The Romans marked their graves with messages to the dead. One famous inscription from a mother named Veturia reads, "To my sweetest son, who lived 3 years, 4 months, 9 days, may the earth be light upon you." Another from a father, "I lift you in my arms, my sweetest son, as you were before, and I press you to my lips and hold you in my heart forever." These are not cold people. These are grieving parents, heartbroken over the loss of a child. Infant mortality was high, and they felt every death. And what about marriage? Yes, Roman marriages were often arranged for political or economic reasons. But that doesn't mean love didn't grow. Pliny the Younger, a writer and senator, wrote a beautiful letter to his wife Calpurnia when they were apart. "I am seized with an incredible longing for you. The reason is love, which is strong enough in itself, but our long separation makes it stronger. I lie awake at night thinking of you." The Romans had a word for it. Caritas. Dearness, affection, love. They felt it. They expressed it. They were not the cold marble statues we imagine. The military again. The testudo formation. One last military myth. Everyone has seen the testudo, the tortoise formation. Soldiers lock their shields together, front and overhead, creating an impenetrable shell. It's the ultimate symbol of Roman discipline. The testudo was a common, everyday formation used in many battles. The testudo was a specialized situational formation used mostly in sieges. It was slow, exhausting, and vulnerable. The testudo was real. We have descriptions from ancient historians and even a relief on Trajan's column showing it in action. But it wasn't used in open battle. Think about it. You're in a box of shields. You can barely see. You can barely move. You're hot, cramped, and disoriented. If you're marching in testudo, you're moving at a crawl. In open battle, against a mobile enemy, you'd be slaughtered. The enemy would just flank you, hit you from the sides or rear, or wait for you to stumble and break formation. The testudo was used in specific situations, most often in sieges. When approaching a fortified wall, archers and slingers on top could rain down missiles on you. The testudo protected you from above. You could inch forward, protected, until you reached the wall and could start your assault. It was also used against cavalry archers like the Parthians. The Roman historian Cassius Dio describes a battle where the Romans formed a testudo to protect themselves from a hail of arrows. But even then, it was a desperate measure. The formation was so heavy and slow that the enemy could just ride away and shoot from a different angle. The testudo was a testament to Roman discipline, but it was a tool for specific jobs, not a magic bullet for every battle. So here we are at the end of. And if you've been keeping track, we've now demolished about 30 of the biggest myths about ancient Rome. What have we learned? That the Romans were not caricatures. They weren't the bloodthirsty monsters of Hollywood, or the marble gods of Renaissance paintings, or the decadent perverts of later moralists. They were people. Complicated, brilliant, flawed, ordinary people. They built an empire that lasted 1,000 years, not because they were superhuman, but because they were incredibly good at learning from others, adapting ideas, and building systems that worked. They made mistakes. They had their share of madmen and fools. But they also had their philosophers, their poets, their loving parents, their hard-working soldiers, their creative engineers. The myths persist because they're easy. It's easy to imagine a world of simple villains and simple heroes. It's harder to grapple with the messy reality of history. But that messy reality is where the truth lives, and the truth about Rome is more interesting, more human, and more valuable than any myth. Thanks for sticking with me through. There's plenty more where this came from. The Romans left behind a mountain of evidence, and every piece of it tells a story. Some of those stories are true. Some are lies. It's our job to tell the difference. Until next time.